All right, let's dive into one of the oldest, most mind-bending questions in all of history. To even begin to answer it, we need to wrap our heads around a really powerful philosophical idea, one that tries to build a case, one logical step at a time. This is the argument from contingency.
It really all boils down to this one question. I mean, think about it for a second. Why does anything exist at all? Why isn't there just nothing? Absolute, total emptiness. This single, massive question is the launchpad for everything we're going to talk about today. You see, what's so cool is that our brains are practically hardwired to look for an explanation. If you walked into your house and saw a broken window, you wouldn't just shrug and say, a broken window. No way. You'd immediately start looking for the cause, right? Was it a baseball? The wind? We have this powerful instinct to connect an effect to its cause, and it's that very human impulse that drives this whole philosophical quest. Okay, to really get this argument, we need to get two key terms down. First up is contingent. A contingent thing is basically anything that depends on something else to exist. So a tree is contingent. It needs a seed, water, sunlight. You and I, we're contingent. We needed our parents. The key idea here is that anything that could have not existed is a contingent. And on the flip side of contingent, you have necessary. A necessary being is something that exists all on its own. It doesn't depend on anything else. Its very nature is to exist. It couldn't not exist. It just is. So keep these two ideas in your head. Contingent things that need a cause and a necessary thing that doesn't. So here's the big move the argument makes. It looks around and says, hey, the universe is just packed to the gills with contingent things. Everything we see, touch, and experience depends on something else. The argument then concludes that this whole massive chain of dependent things has to be anchored to a single necessary being. As the poet Golub so beautifully put it, when there was nothing, there was God. If there was nothing, God would be.
Now, this isn't some new idea somebody just cooked up. This is a line of thinking that's been sharpened and refined by some of the most brilliant minds in history, spanning different centuries, cultures, and philosophical traditions. So let's take a quick trip through time and see how this thing developed.
Our journey kicks off in ancient Greece with the one and only Aristotle. He looked out at the world and saw constant change, constant motion. Everything was always in the process of becoming something else. And this simple observation led him to a really profound conclusion.
So Aristotle's logic went like this. Every motion has to have a cause, right? A hand swings a bat, the bat hits a ball. But what moved the hand, and what moved that? He said this chain of cause and effect can't just go back into the past forever, because if it did, nothing would ever have gotten started in the first place. Think of it like a train with an infinite number of cars. If there's no engine at the front to give that first pull, the entire train just sits there, motionless. There has to be a first cause, an unmoved mover, that starts all the motion without being moved by anything else.
So Aristotle got the ball rolling, but centuries later, other brilliant minds picked it up and ran with it in a new direction. Thinkers like the great Islamic scholar Ibn Sina and the Christian theologian Thomas Aquinas took Aristotle's core logic and applied it to something even bigger. They shifted the whole conversation from the cause of motion to the cause of existence itself. Aquinas, in particular, posed this absolutely killer question. He looked around and saw that everything is contingent. It comes into being and eventually it ceases to be. But he wondered, what if everything that ever existed was like that? If that were true, then it's totally possible there could have been a time when there was absolutely nothing. And if there was ever a moment of pure, total nothingness, well, you can't get something from nothing. The very fact that we are here, that a contingent world exists, proves that there must be something that is not contingent, something that had to exist. Okay, let's fast forward to the 17th century, where the German polymath Gottfried Leibniz gives this argument its most powerful modern form. I mean, this is the guy who co-invented calculus, so you know he's bringing some serious intellectual firepower. And he introduced a concept that really took this whole debate to another level. Leibniz came up with what he called the principle of sufficient reason. It sounds complicated, but the idea is pretty straightforward. For anything that exists, there has to be a good enough, complete explanation for why it's there and why it is the way it is. Nothing just is for no reason. And he didn't just apply this to little things in the universe, he aimed this principle at the biggest target possible, the universe as a whole.
And this is where his logic just shines. Our universe, he argued, is obviously contingent. It could have been totally different, or it could have been empty. So the explanation for it can't come from inside it. The reason for it has to be something that is not contingent. It has to be necessary, something whose very non-existence is a logical impossibility, kind of like how 2 + 2 = 4. You can't even imagine a world where that's not true. That, Leibniz said, is the kind of rock-solid explanation our universe requires.
Okay, so the argument seems pretty solid, right? Well, not so fast. Because in the world of philosophy, no great argument goes unchallenged. And the argument from contingency has run into some of the most powerful critiques you can imagine, critiques that poke holes in its core logic.
You had thinkers like David Hume asking, how can we even talk about a necessary being? All our knowledge comes from experience, and I've certainly never seen one of those. Then Immanuel Kant came along and suggested that maybe cause and effect isn't a rule of the universe, but just the way our human minds are built to organize the world. And of course, others asked a much simpler question. Why does the universe as a whole need a cause anyway? Why can't the chain of causes just go back forever?
But probably the most famous, most devastating critique came from the 20th century philosopher Bertrand Russell. He claimed the whole argument makes a fundamental logical mistake, and he summed it up with this perfectly clear, intuitive little analogy. Russell said the argument commits what's known as the fallacy of composition, and that's just a fancy way of saying it's a mistake to assume that just because something is true for all the parts of a thing, it must also be true for the thing as a whole. Let's break that down. Look, we all agree that every person, every star, every event we see inside the universe seems to have a cause. But Russell's point is, why does that mean the entire collection of things, the universe itself, has to have a single external cause? Just because every brick in a wall is small doesn't mean the wall itself is small. The rule that applies to the parts doesn't automatically apply to the whole shebang.
So what's the alternative then? For Russell, the universe might just be what philosophers call a brute fact. It just is. It exists, and that's the end of the story. There's no further explanation. In this view, asking why is there a universe is kind of a silly question, like asking what's north of the North Pole. The universe is the end of the line for all our why questions.
So where on earth does that leave us? Well, we've basically arrived at a classic philosophical showdown. It's a fundamental clash between two completely different ways of looking at reality itself.
On one side, you've got the position that our reason just demands an explanation. A universe full of dependent things just hanging there with nothing to support them feels incomplete, and it must be grounded in a self-sufficient, necessary being. But on the other side, you've got the position that the universe is the ultimate explanation. Our endless search for a cause beyond it is just a quirk of our minds, a human impulse we're wrongly projecting onto the cosmos.
Now, this whole time, there's probably been one big question bubbling up in your mind. It's the most common counterargument of all, and it feels like a total checkmate. If everything needs a cause, then what caused the necessary being, or God?
But here's the classic philosophical reply, and it's a very precise one. The argument was never everything has a cause. That's a common misreading. The actual premise is every contingent thing has a cause. A necessary being, by its very definition, is not contingent. It's the one and only thing in this whole picture that doesn't need a cause, because its very nature is simply to exist. It's the uncaused cause that the whole chain of dominoes depends on.
And so, we end up right back where we began, staring into the face of this ultimate mystery. Is the existence of our universe simply a brute, unexplained fact that we just have to accept? Or is it the final step in a chain of logic that points to something beyond itself, a necessary foundation for all of reality? The debate has raged for centuries, and it continues today. The final answer? Well, that's left for you to ponder.